we see a little bit of this dynamic of voting against someone rather than voting for someone. So in 2016, it was really much more about voting against Hillary Clinton, and 2020 was much more about voting against Donald Trump. So with that dynamic at play, so if anyone ever becomes the nominee that is not Biden or Trump, I actually think you're going to see tremendous momentum that way. Now, whether that happens, we could throw our tinfoil hats on about why Gavin Newsom is doing this or not. And I have my own theories. I'm not convinced that this primary season is as dead set and a foregone conclusion as others may lead you to believe.
Hello and welcome again to another episode of Sacktown Talks. Today we're glad to be joined by Chris Lane with Signal Polling and Research. Chris, how's it going? And thanks for joining us.
Jared, thanks so much for having me. I appreciate it.
Yeah, where were you at today, Chris?
I'm located in Boston.
Yeah.
I grew up working for Governor Charlie Baker, the Republican governor of Massachusetts, for 8 years. But I do a ton of work in California and up and down the West Coast. And anytime there's an opportunity to talk about doing red work in blue states, that's what's of greatest interest to me.
Oh, fascinating. So how'd you get interested in polling and kind of go down that path?
Yeah, sure. Well, I started as a 16-year-old an intern at the Massachusetts State House and did a couple years there and jumped on campaign after campaign and then ended up working for Governor Baker in Massachusetts for 8 years, actually a little longer than that, including before he was elected. Was a consultant for a little while, and then I've been a pollster for the last 5 years with Signal. We're ranked the number one most accurate polling firm in the country by 538 the last 3 cycles. Nice. And I've just always been really interested in the numbers. And there's a lot of talking heads, a lot of opinions, a lot of narratives. But when you're a slave to the numbers do the talking for you.
Right. So I guess, how did you specifically get into polling and kind of, start working for Signal?
Sure. Well, I've always been really interested in how data affects the outcome of elections. So whether that was targeting the right voters with the right message from a grassroots standpoint, or later on in my career, really understanding what you need to message and how you need to message it to specific audiences. So, for example, popular messaging is not always effective messaging. And the example I use time and time again is term limits. Term limits pulls off the charts. 80, 85, 90% of people are for term limits. But when it comes down to truly deciding between one candidate and another, the idea of where you stand on term limits impacts almost 0 votes. So I've always preached to candidates, there's a difference between popular and effective, and helping them bridge that gap has always been, a passion of mine.
That's interesting. So it's kind of like where the axis meets popular and effective is kind of where you start really moving and gaining ground.
Exactly. And if you're a Republican running for office and you stick to Republican talking points all the time, you're going to win exactly 0 Democrats and not enough independents in order to win. And the same is true vice versa. So understanding what messages work, where, is the key to the whole game. And that's not to be disingenuous or talking out of both sides of your mouth. But, for example, if you're talking about secure the border, there's one way to say it in a Republican primary, it's, build the wall. And there's another way to say it. Well, let's stop the traffic of humans and fentanyl and, unsustainable immigration into our country. One works for one audience, one works for another.
Right. So I guess how do you find what's effective? Like you can obviously find what's popular, right, by polling and seeing what polls well, but how do you find what's, I guess, effective?
Yeah. So it's called message mapping. And so what we do is we ask people, are you with candidate A or candidate B? And we see where that initial ballot question stands. And then we introduce a series of messaging about candidate A or about candidate B. And then we ask again at the end which candidate you would vote for. And based on the answers to that question, we can actually measure what message moved people on the ballot. Not necessarily the message they liked the most, but the message that actually got them from one candidate to the other or from undecided to the other.
Oh, interesting. A lot's been kind of, the polling world's, I guess, changed a lot in the last, 10 years. It used to be if you had an online poll, that people would call it a quote unquote garbage poll. But now, we're talking to pollsters and they're basically saying you got to meet the voters where where they are, whether it's on Instagram, or are they on YouTube TV, are they on online texting, so forth. Can you kind of talk about polling changes and like how you guys are reaching out to people and getting your information?
Yeah, I mean, you hit the nail on the head. For about 50 years there, polling was quite easy. You called X amount of people, you got 5 to 10% of people to pick up and actually take your survey, and you actually could reach the individual quotas you needed for each audience. You know that you need 52% women, and you know you need 12% who make $0 to $50,000 a year, and on and on and on between your demographic groups. But somewhere around the mid 2010s, that became less effective. People stopped picking up their phone, and those pickup rates went from 5 to 4 to 3 to 2 to 1%. And so hard to reach audiences. I use the example of busy moms all the time. The chances you call a busy mom at 5 o'clock in the afternoon and expect them to pick up the phone and take your survey is virtually zero. And to your exact point, it's about meeting them in which the medium where they exist. But if you text them a poll and they have 5 minutes to themselves at the end of the night when they're laying in bed, they want their voices heard too. So they are willing to take that poll in that medium. We've done thousands and thousands and thousands of tests on this. The medium in which you conduct your poll or collect your sample, I should say, has very little impact on the actual results. It's about actually creating a poll that represents the electorate. That's called effective sample size. So before we even conduct one question, one interview, we know exactly what our sample needs to look like because we know what the electorate is going to look like. And until you represent them properly, your poll means nothing. The final example I'll give is, let's say you do a poll of 400 voters, which is a pretty good sample if you're trying to look at a congressional district, a state Senate district in California. But if you just collect your first 400, the odds that you got the exact correct 400 people to represent your electorate is zero. So what you really need is a sample of 5 or 600 that's trimmed backwards in order to go back to your 400, because you cut out the people that you have excess of, and you make sure you hit each and one of those quotas. Industry standard on effective sample size is about 70-75%, and then a whole bunch of weighting goes on. At Signal, the reason we've been ranked the number one polling firm in the country 3 straight cycles is because we don't do that. We do not let anything leave our doors at that level. We make sure we get to as close as 100% effective sample size as humanly possible.
Yeah, it's interesting. We've had, pollsters on before, California Focus, and they talk about nationally how difficult it is to get a pulse on the nation because every state's different. And there's states that have different kind of micro political climates within them. And, being an expert at all that is difficult. Kind of how does Signal approach that and kind of able to kind of create this, nationwide polling dynamic?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, first and foremost, you need a large enough sample size. The idea that you're going to get a good read of the whole country with a 600, 800 sample is just not the case. When we do our national survey, it's usually about a 2,500 sample, sometimes more, because we know that's what we need to actually represent the electorate. California is a difficult place to poll because there's so many pockets that we need to poll in both in English and in Spanish. And there's demographic splits in those places that we have to make sure we hit. So California actually is a more difficult state to poll than most states nationally, because those states are much more homogenous than we see in California, for example.
Yeah, we're coming into what presidential primary season where your work probably gets the busiest here, and I guess the most attention. Kind of what are you seeing nationally and on the presidential races, and kind of what we're going to be hearing about next year?
Yeah, so I mean, as far as the presidential is concerned, Donald Trump has had a stranglehold on this thing since it started. I will say though, Trump constantly touts that he has this 40-50 point lead, which is true on national polls. But when we're talking about presidential races, national polls don't really mean anything because the nation does not vote together on this. It is a
Right.
state by state by state issue, and it is a momentum builder per state. People drop out, people come in. So the idea that this dynamic is unmovable, I think, is untrue. Donald Trump is absolutely the heavy favorite, and at this point, looks like he will be the nominee. But as we head into New Hampshire and Iowa, I think we're going to see a dynamic shift. I think we're going to see people drop out. And then a poll that we did a little while back showed about 30% of the Republican primary electorate is voting for Donald Trump no matter what. That is locked and loaded in almost every single state. And there's about another 30% that plans to vote for Donald Trump, but say they're open to an alternative. So right now, Trump has done a really good job of securing the majority of that. But the idea that this thing is over, I just don't find to be the case. And I'm really interested to see who drops out and where their support goes because traditionally you're either a Trump person or you're not. And I would have said that Ron DeSantis folks would have naturally gone to Donald Trump, but Trump has created such a wall between himself and DeSantis that if you're still on the DeSantis train at this point, I'm not positive you go back to Trump. And that's where I think someone like Nikki Haley could actually make this a race.
It's interesting. We just had Gavin Newsom go and debate Ron DeSantis on Fox News, and kind of everyone's kind of wondering, like, why is he doing this? Why is DeSantis doing this? What's the upside? Have you guys done any polling before and after the debate to kind of see, how they did or how people are feeling about, them after the debate?
So specifically before and after this debate, no, we have tested Governor Newsom in the past in a hypothetical matchup. I think it's safe to say that any Republican other than Donald Trump does better against Joe Biden, and any Democrat other than Joe Biden does better against Donald Trump. We see a little bit of this dynamic of voting against someone rather than voting for someone. So in 2016, it was really much more about voting against Hillary Clinton, and 2020 was much more about voting against Donald Trump. So with that dynamic at play, if anyone ever becomes the nominee that is not Biden or Trump, I actually think you're going to see tremendous momentum that way. Now, whether that happens, we could throw our tinfoil hats on about why Gavin Newsom is doing this or not, and I have my own theories. But I'm not convinced that this primary season is as dead set and a foregone conclusion as others may lead you to believe.
It just seems unfathomable that we're going to have a rematch of the 2020 election, and both of these guys are I guess, kind of really unpopular, right? Just
It's not just really unpopular; it's historically unpopular. We could have the two most unpopular candidates running against each other in modern history.
that's unbelievable. Kind of what can you give us like a sense of like what is like Joe Biden polling at a national level in comparison to I guess previous incumbents?
As far as his favor, so we measure that by favorable, unfavorable, and Joe
Mhm.
Biden has been historically low for a long time. I would say the closest comp was towards the end of the Bush years when he was really unpopular at the beginning of the recession. He's sort of in that neighborhood. He's been in the high 30s, low 40s for the majority of the last 2 years. We've actually seen a slight bump for Joe Biden in the last 30 days. I credit to that to how he's handled the situation in Israel, and I think he's gotten a little bit of kudos for you know some of the work he's done there. Whether that's a bump in the state of what's happening or a sustainable thing is yet to be determined.
That's interesting. Last time you were talking earlier about how, 2020 was more of a vote against a candidate. It was a vote against Trump.
Yeah.
As Trump would say, I got the most votes of any incumbent in history, yet he still lost because more people hated him than wanted to support him. Kind of, what are you seeing on the hatred level? Is Trump as hated today as he was 4 years ago?
I wouldn't phrase it that way, but he does sustain the same unfavorables as he has for a while. In fact, we've actually seen his unfavorables rise a little bit just recently. Um, the idea of him coming into all the indictments and actually gaining popularity was true, because you had a whole bunch of folks who were sort of sick of the tone and temperament that Donald Trump brought to the Oval Office, and we're ready to move on to someone new. But voters, especially middle right, and especially non college educated men, saw this as such a unfair and political motivated attack that they actually brought them back to him, which was the exact opposite of what those folks intended.
That's fascinating. And that's kind of what, people keep asking is like, how come no other candidate can, get any traction here? Like, kind of, what are you saying?
So for me, it all comes back to emotion. And voting is the most emotional thing we can do. And pretty much every decision we make is done emotionally and then justified with logic after the fact. And say what you want about Donald Trump, good, bad, or indifferent, he evokes an emotional response. And usually those things are as far away on a spectrum as you could possibly get, which is why we see time and time again that Donald Trump's numbers are what we call very hard numbers. They're not soft, they're not easily movable, they're intense feelings. And Donald Trump evokes that response. Somehow, a New York billionaire made people, small town folks across the country, feel like he knew people just like them and was standing up for people just like them. And at this point, any attack on him, those people interpret it as attack on themselves and their way of life. And that is where the more you confront folks with maybe some of the flaws of Donald Trump as a candidate, the harder they've dug their heels in. And they're not going anywhere.
Yeah. You know, it's interesting. We just had a Democratic campaign consultant on, and he was talking about, they're aware that Biden's very unpopular and they're kind of worried about down ballot turnout. And basically, their messaging is going to be, this going back to the well of, we got to stand up against Trump. Do you expect that to evoke as much, I guess, turnout as it did 4 years ago?
Yeah. And that's where if Trump and Biden end up not being the nominees, one or the other, I think we're going to see a huge impact on turnout, specifically non college educated men. That huge chunk of voters that voted for in 2016 for the very first time and voted in 2020 for the second time, a large portion of those folks will not come out if Donald Trump is not on the ballot. So in 50-50 districts, hyper competitive districts that decide Congress, I'm sorry, the House, those folks are usually not looking for Donald Trump to be the nominee because he hurts um, candidates in that middle ground, that persuasive universe. However, that portion of the base that they had never had before because they didn't ever come out and vote also makes up a substantial portion of the electorate. So, yes, you could win the middle by a larger margin by not being affiliated with Donald Trump as a true independent. You're going to lose a bunch of hardcore Republican votes that would never, ever vote Democrat if Donald Trump's not that nominee. And the same goes for the idea of if Joe Biden's not the nominee, that dynamic of voting against Hillary, voting against Trump, and now voting against Biden, you're going to lose a bunch of those folks too. We've had historically high turnout in the last few elections, which is a great thing as far as voter participation. But I think people have lost sight that that is not the norm. And we
Right.
had very consistent trends for about 30, 40 years prior to. So it's a matter of whether we sustain this hyper growth in turnout or we go back to normally historical types of turnout.
Yeah, I guess this is another narrative you hear a lot among some Republicans that, 4 years ago people didn't like Donald Trump, but now that 4 years have passed and they've had 4 years of Biden, people are like, well, maybe he wasn't so bad. Are you seeing any of that in your data?
Yes and no. I mean, of the people who voted for Joe Biden in 2020, just 3% of them say they're now going to vote for Donald Trump. So the idea that there's just all this regret out there, I'm not
Mhm.
sure is the case. I think people do miss $2 gas. I do think people miss a little more, stability in the world, particularly with in Russia and Ukraine and Israel and Gaza and everything that's happening in the world. But I also think there were dynamics at play there that um, uh, we might be looking back with rose-colored glasses as to what was actually happening at that time. What I think it's really about is independence and which way they're leaning, one way or the other. And then finally, I think just like there were a group of Republicans who had never voted before. There was a whole bunch of college-educated females, in particular, that typically don't vote or don't vote quite as often. That 100% voted in 2020. Not to mention the accessibility of mail-in ballots, nationwide and historic rates that we just have never seen before. That will likely um, continue to increase turnout, particularly for Democratic candidates.
Yeah, it's interesting. 2 years ago we were hearing about this, red wave that was going to happen, and
Yeah.
the Republicans just barely took the House. Kind of what trend do you see happening, for the next election cycle? Are the you know are which party is going to take control of the House and the Senate?
Yeah. So, I mean, the days after Election Day, every phone call I got was, where'd the big red wave go? And over time and through studying it and doing some aftermath polling, we learned a few things. One, um, the Dobbs decision had a huge impact on so many 50-50 districts. Places where Republicans probably would have won by 1 or 2 or 3%, they lost by 1 or 2 or 3% because the turnout in a midterm from females and college educated females was so much higher than we typically see. So that had a big influence. The other mistake I think Republicans made last cycle was exactly what we were just talking about. And it's that evoking that emotional response. I don't think they did a good job of telling their story. And the best example I can give is inflation. 7.836% inflation means nothing to no one. No one understands what that feels like. But when you start talking about, okay, I'm going to the grocery store and then I'm going on my way home and stopping and getting my kids' soccer cleats versus just I'm going to the grocery store and I can't make that second stop. That's an emotional story. That's a response. That's what I think Republicans missed. And as far as telling that story versus these large numbers that, I don't think the general voter really interprets. It reminds me a lot about Mitt Romney in 2012 talking about the national debt. 20, 18, 25, $30 trillion. These are all fake numbers to voters.
Right.
And in the difference between 15 trillion and 30 trillion, it means nothing as far as their pocketbook, their house, their neighborhood, their schools. So that's where I thought that was a losing message, although a very important message. And I wish we would wake up to that. That's where I think that went wrong. But to answer your question, heading into the next cycle, I think we're going to see uh, a continued focus on the border. I think immigration probably would have been the number two issue last cycle. But once the Dobbs decision hit, that completely took the wind out of those sails. And now we're seeing that again, and the border crossing and the financial implications and the drug and human trafficking implications. I think you're going to see a lot more of that heading into next cycle. I think you see homelessness at all-time rates in major cities around the country and the surrounding suburbs of most of those cities that are frustrated. So and then finally, I think it'll continue to be a referendum on defunding the police, backing the blue, and actually restoring some law and order that hasn't happened in previous cycles. So, from a Republican standpoint, I think that's really where they have to focus. Democrats are going to make most of this election about abortion all over again. And it was an effective tactic last time. I'm not sure it's going to have the same punch this time around. Trying to convince voters from California that somehow abortion is going to be taken away from them is just not true. And I think it's going to fall on more deaf ears this time around than it did last time. Um, so we'll see how it all plays out. Polls are a snapshot in time. I think we'll see a bunch of changes between now and then. But for now, that's where I see this election going.
Yeah. You said you even though you're located in Boston, you would focus mostly on the West Coast. Kind of what kind of are some of the trends and concerns people in California are kind of some things that you're monitoring right now?
Yeah, and I am located in Boston, and New England's home for me. But most of the work I do is in blue and purple states. So it's about 30 different states around the country that I do work in. California, in particular, I think is ready for this pendulum swing that I don't think most people are anticipating. We saw it in New York last cycle in a major way. That for too long, you know. The left agenda had been pushed and pushed and pushed, and you finally saw that swing back. They had a gubernatorial candidate that almost won. They flipped 5 or 6 congressional seats. They won a bunch of seats in their House Assembly and the Senate. You saw a big swing, particularly around the issue of cashless bail in New York. And so, whether that's not that specific issue in California, I think you're going to see that pendulum swing back the other way regarding inflation, regarding the economy, regarding um, police, regarding homelessness, and I think situations like California cleaning up all their streets when China comes to visit, but unwilling to do so at other points is exactly the frustration that a lot of Californians feel. And the other thing I've noticed over time, New England, for example, has zero Republican congressmen in all of New England. So the idea that California is this blue place is just not the case. There's a lot of Republican pockets and a lot of Republican congressmen from California. And I actually think you're going to see an increase over the coming cycles in places like that.
That's interesting because that was my next question. We had, some of the closest elections we've seen historically 2 years ago. And so it's kind of like, which way is this pendulum going to swing? We hear it from both sides. Kind of what are you seeing in the data?
Yeah, I think it'll have to do a lot with what the economy does between now and next November. But I certainly see that swing heading towards Republicans in 2024, and probably even more so in 2026. The way off years work, typically blue states have more of a Republican, higher percent of Republican turnout in governor's years than we see in presidential years. And so when Republicans and independents make up a slightly higher percentage of the vote, they become much more competitive. Whereas in a presidential year, everyone votes, and the numbers in California don't add up too wonderfully for Republicans. So I think you'll see a good showing in 2024, but I'd really look at 2026 as a benchmark mover and shaker.
Yeah. For, the advocates and politicians listening, who are looking for some polling help, kind of what are some of the differences that signal officers versus some of the tried and true kind of California pollers they commonly use?
Yeah, and just to be clear, we've done a lot of work in California, a lot of congressionals, a lot of school choice work, a lot of legislative work, and I'm in California a lot. We are probably newer to California than some of these historical uh, polling firms. But I'd say a few things. One, the effective sample size I mentioned earlier. When you talk to your pollster, make sure that when you're paying for a 400 sample, that you're getting a 400 sample, because if you're getting your 400 sample and it's really only representing about 75% of the electorate, you're really getting a 300 sample. So why pay for a 400 sample when you're only getting a 300? That's one thing. Two is what I talked about earlier about message mapping, and the idea that there is a difference between popular and effective, and the ability to measure that, and the ability to target voters with that. Another thing I would say is segmentation analysis, which is basically this idea of going into an election, a 50-50 race. You probably know, not probably, we will know with a great deal of certainty that about 40% are with you, 40% against you. What does that 20% look like? And it used to be, target independence and persuasive universes. But just because you're in that middle 20% doesn't mean you're an independent, doesn't mean you're right down the middle. I know some registered nonpartisans who are much more Republican than registered Republicans. So who are those folks? What drives them? What are they passionate about? Are they male and female? What part of the district do they live in? We want to understand that. And then finally, I'd say that emotion part of what we do. We do something called emotive analysis, where we take open response verbatims and understand what emotions people are feeling. What are they talking about? What words are they using? And then that way, when we're, you know, creating mail, creating digital, knocking on doors, doing stump speeches, that we're using the same language and the same emotions that voters are talking to us about. So it's about relating to people, creating emotional bonds, and telling your own story. And the data helps give you that compass to know how to do it.
Yeah, fascinating. Well, if some of our listeners want to reach out to you and kind of get you some business, Chris, what's the best way to kind of find you and get in touch?
Yeah, I appreciate it. Our company is Signal, CYGNAL. Our website is cygn.al. And my email address is chrisl@cygn.al. You can find me on Twitter. You can find me on LinkedIn. But I'd love to talk to you. And I'll be back in California in about 4 weeks, and probably every 4 weeks after that.
Okay.
So looking forward to talking to whoever wants to. And it's going to be an exciting election cycle.
Awesome. Great. And who should the Patriots take with the number one pick this year?
Oh, God, that's tough. Now I'm talking to an SC audience, and I'm a little nervous. Uh, He makes me a little nervous. I'm not going to lie. I don't like that he's not playing in your bowl game. I think that's a soft move, but uh, it's time to hit the reset button in New England for the Patriots, and
Uh, See
I
how the
hope he makes the
painted
right.
nails and Belichick go along. That should be interesting.
Exactly.
Awesome. Well, thanks, Chris. Great chatting with you, and look forward to maybe catching up with you later on as this presidential cycle gets a little closer.
Thanks, Jared. Looking forward to coming back, and have a good night.
Awesome. Thanks, Chris.